So our third presenter is David Shaw, again, Faculty of Education. Why would anyone use critical realism to research the education of children affected by parental incarceration? Developing a methodology. Okay, thanks a lot, David.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you. So this is part of an article I'm trying to write for the Journal of Critical Realism that reflects on my research area. So it's really addressing just the methodology of my research. But that said, I'm going to have to give a little bit of background, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So what we're going to see today is kind of like a mixture of my research and the article I'm trying to work on to get published. So if it's a bit disjointed, that's entirely my fault. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'd also like to say thank you to my supervisory team, which is currently Professor Liz McKinley and Dr. Catherine Hastings. I lost my original supervisory team and my initial introduction into critical realism, which is why my PhD is probably taking as long as it is. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Bundjalung Nation. I live in a place called Bogangar, which is just south of here, that some of you I'm sure will know. So my orientation to this research comes from a background in teaching. I've been teaching for north of 24 years in secondary school. So I acknowledge that I have certain ways of thinking and interacting with young people that are different and not necessarily always helpful, but are entrenched within my research. So what I'm going to run through today are the things upon the board. So my orientation to the research focus, and you can see the rest. And hopefully by the end of it, I'll have given you an indication of why I've chosen to use critical realism within my research area. So how did I come to this research? So some of you may have heard this story before, but it's important that we realize quite how enmeshed we are within our research in these sort of settings, quite how entrenched we are. This comes from an interaction I had with a young man we're going to call Dan, and we're going to say he was in year 9, and we're going to say it was on a Tuesday morning. None of those things are true, because the ethics surrounding my interactions with a student are relatively complex. So I found out that Dan's parent, his father, in fact, had gone back to jail. From hushed tones, from a colleague in a staff room after break, it was like she was telling me a horrible secret, a dirty little secret about this boy in my care. And I tried to find out what I could do to help him. And that led me into my master's research, where I found out that a group of teachers like myself, I studied 40 teachers with experiences here in Australia, in the UK, and also in the United States. And none of us really had much experience or knowledge of working with young people who've got a parent who's gone to jail. And eventually I managed to get my PhD started on this very subject area, having initially been told, you can't do that, that's too difficult, it's going to be ethically too challenging, you're not going to be able to study it in school, how on earth are you going to be able to get this going? But I didn't take no for an answer. And you'll also see on the board there's another statement, would I let my kid go to the party? And that comes from that original piece of research where a colleague turned around to me, this is a colleague in school, not in university, who had primary school kids and found out that one of his child's classmates, a parent, had gone to jail. And then they had a rush, like a realization, almost like an epiphany about how deep and how complex it is for some of these young people, the environment in which they live. So my research focus is these things. My research question at the bottom is really simple. It's almost like a grounded piece of research. So I'm trying to find out what school is like for young people with incarcerated parents. Not just children, because I'll be working with, and as I'll explain in a moment, I'll be working with slightly older children as well. My background in education, secondary education, so that's where I originally met Dan. So what you can see on the board is really a bleak sort of picture. It describes the problems these young people face within their education, within their lives, within their social settings, within their family settings, with their health, their physical health and their mental health, a whole range of challenges. But that's not the complete picture. The complete picture is something we don't yet know because there's very little research being done with these young people. It's ethically quite difficult to reach out to these young people. Within school settings, teachers don't know who these young people are. Educational authorities don't collect or collate that data. So it's like a difficult group of children to reach, but also a hidden group. So we're still looking at the conceptual landscape, how our ideas are formed about these people. We've got notions that are deep within society of criminal behavior, criminality, recidivism. We've got ideas of what that might mean in terms of the young people, in terms of shame and stigma. We've also got ideas of parenting, and there's a conflict between our view of parenting and our view of criminality. And there's like a dichotomy exists between those two ideas. So you can see there's an entangled picture, a deeply complex ontological problem in order to study these young people, to try and make some sense. Because at the end of the day, as a teacher, what I wanted to do was help Dan. How can I make any of this help Dan? Well, that's where I came to think. I didn't come to think, I was given an idea saying, have you considered using a depth ontology? I hadn't considered using a depth ontology. I didn't know what a depth ontology was. I didn't know how it would help me. And I was led by my initial supervisor at the time, who was at this university, Brad Shipway, who was a critical realist. In the same way some people are evangelizing about religion, everywhere he went, he took critical realism with him, and that's where I got it from. It's a bit like an infection. I might pass it on to you if you're unlucky. Do that again. Okay. So a depth ontology in this context relies on these three structured ideas. That what we see, the behavior of the young people, the deficits that they encounter, is in the domain of the empirical, what we can measure, what we can see. So their behaviors, their attitudes, their absenteeism, their poor educational outcomes, their mental health, we can measure all of those things, but those aren't causal events. Those are caused by things that are happening in the domain of the actual. And those might be the disruption to the family routine. They might be the poverty that the family now faces. They might be the effects of shame and stigma. But those things themselves are also a product of something that's going on, an intangible layer called the real, the domain of the real. These ideas come from Bhaskar, who is the founder of critical realism, who founded these ideas in around 1975, between 1975 and 1979. And the deep-seated ideas, the deep-seated causal events, mechanisms and structures that we're looking for are likely to be found outside the understanding of the young people themselves. So how do I develop a piece of research where I'm talking to the young people, but looking for something that's affecting their behavior that isn't of themselves? Good question. Critical realism gives us three tools to help us develop a methodology. Critical realism isn't a methodology. Bhaskar called it an underlaborer. So it's really a philosophical orientation to science that you can use within your, what I can use within my PhD, within your studies, within your research. Ontological realism. If a tree falls over in a forest, does it make a noise? Critical realism would say yes. It might make a different noise to every different observer, but it actually makes a noise. In the context of my research, these people, young people, are definitely affected by structures within society. Epistemic relativism. Epistemic relativism says that we will all bring our own thoughts and our own attitudes and our own understanding. That's why it's important for you to know I'm a teacher, because I carry a bag of teacher-based prejudices. We use shorthand in education like at risk attached to these young people. At risk carries a huge weight with it. It carries ideas of drug taking, of truancy, of early pregnancy, of homelessness, and that's what we mean by at risk. And I am prone to those thoughts. So epistemic relativism, we will all have a different attitude to those people, those young people. We have a savior, that's judgmental rationality. Judgmental rationality says that you can go and cherry pick some useful tools to try and help you understand the best way of looking at the problem in front of you. Not just bracketing out my teacherness, if you like, but actually understanding that that's enmeshed within the research that I'm doing. Okay, so how did I use critical realism to develop the interview questions? Because in any research, the interview questions are the interface between your ideas and how you access the information you're looking for. So I've looked to work with these young people using semi-structured interviews so that there is some scope for them to tell me things that I haven't thought of. But the questions I am going to ask are going to help me define quite which structures and mechanisms are at play in their lives that we're seeing in the classroom. So what did I do? I've got my original research question. My research question's simple. What is school like for these young people? I fished around using judgmental rationality, and I've come up with things that are likely to be important that I can investigate. Their attachment theory, teacher expectations, because I'm focusing on the education of these young people, and the effects of trauma, because we have already defined that trauma is something they will have experienced as a result of parental incarceration. It is a traumatic experience. How's critical realism helping me? Well, it's offering me a stratified ontology. That's the iceberg. It's offering me that critical realist triumvirate, and also a four-planar model, which I shall explain in a moment. There is an additional element, and that's the work of the community where I'm seeking these young people. So I've reached out to the Tweedshire Youth Network, and I've asked them to develop a reference group with me to help guide my research. And they're also helping me reach out to the young people themselves. So without my community partnership offering me perhaps some mitigation of my teacherness, we're reaching out to these young people in the community and youth work. Okay, this is where we get slightly confusing, perhaps. So one of the ways of trying to reveal what the mechanisms are using something that Bhaskar developed a later theory, which is the social interaction four-planar model, which suggests that any social interaction can be measured on four planes simultaneously. What that gives us is an idea or a place to look for what's important to those young people at that moment in time. The four planes we have are the plane of material interactions with nature. That's like a healing opportunity that nature might have. But if you're only exposed to an urban environment, you're only exposed to deprivation, you're only exposed to a negative environment, the effect that that has on that part of your social interaction. I'm going to skip through these quite quickly. On plane B, there's the social interactions, so your positive relationships with other people and other structures. Particularly in the context of school, our friendship group's important. Is it important to have a teacher who has understanding for you? On plane C, you have something called sui generis, which is the culture. And within schools, we have lots of different cultural clues. Some schools are really hard on uniforms, which is a very strange thing. It's in an Australian context. In the UK, uniforms are nowhere near as important. They have structures like we line up when the bell goes, we call teachers sir. How does that culture translate to the young people? Does it help them? Does it make their life simpler? Does it make their life more complicated? Does it make them butt up against rules? Each of the young people I'll be speaking to, with the questions I'm going to ask them, I'm hoping will give an indication as to which elements of these are important in their lives. And finally, the plane of the stratification of the embodied personality. That's within each young person themselves. How many coping mechanisms do they have? How well do they cope with the shame that comes about or is likely to come about from having a parent incarcerated? Okay, so all of those feed in and hopefully help me develop the interview questions. The interview questions themselves, what I've done here is put 3 tables together in a deliberately confusing manner, because what I'm trying to show you here is that on the left-hand side is the table where the questions themselves exist, and Tracy, who writes about qualitative questions, gives you an indication of what sort of questions they are. So my very first question that I've asked young people is, can you describe a day at school to me? And what that gives me is an indication of what's important to them during that school day. It might be, oh, I normally meet up with my friends. It might be, well, I don't very often have breakfast. It's going to give me an indication to which element of their day is important. I can then look at the different theories that I've applied, attachment theory, the trauma-informed brain, and also the Bhaskara's 4-planar model, and see which is indicated. So I developed the questions that I'm asking the young people in the light of what I'm looking for from the results. So almost thinking about doing my analysis before I've actually got the interview questions. Not that I won't allow some data to emerge from the interview questions, but I'm also thinking which structures and mechanisms are likely to be important to these young people. Sorry, important to my research. The young people won't care about them at all. Critical realism finally also offers us the ability to think about the answers that we've been given and look for some deeper analysis, look for those causal mechanisms. Because what I'm trying to do is find ways that a group of us as teachers can help these young people. What is it the young people are saying that is useful to them in school, and what's not so useful? Okay. Whew, did I get that? Yes. I landed it on time. Okay, thank you.
Well, we've still got about 3 minutes for questions, so you only overran by about 2. It's such a fantastic topic.
Oh.
You know, it's worth the full 20 minutes anyway. So, you know, I wasn't too stressed. Anyway, we've got a couple of minutes left for some questions. So I decided, did you have your, I don't know, I'll pass to you first.
My name is Shastri. We published a couple of interesting papers on ontologies, methodological ontologies in the Asia Pacific and African context, in social informatics dimensions. Probably your research has a scope in that context that to build a lot of ontologies using various attributes which you discussed in your presentation. And you can connect with me. We publish a lot of models, ontology models.
Fantastic. What can I say? That's a great question. Any other questions?
I think your work is fantastic.
Thank you.
Congratulations. I love the explanation of critical realism. I think along the critical realism line, I think your work will transcend just the criminal aspect. I think what you're working on is shame, and whatever your results produce will help teachers across the board manage shame within the individual cohort. So not a question.
Another great question. Thank you. Thank you. It's a really lovely comment. Thank
I
you.
actually have a bit of a question myself. So,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, it's all right. We can have more over there, but I'm not exercising my chairmanship. So look, we know that First Australians are dreadfully overrepresented in the prison population in Australia, and that's obviously going to flow through to their families and stuff like that. Now, did that raise any particular methodological issues for you, nuances for you that need to be taken into account? If so, how did you deal with that?
So certainly within the ethics application, so the two stages of the ethics application, reaching out to the community and the community involvement helped me work through exactly what sort of questions we were going to be developing in the context of what I'm looking at here. In terms of the research broadly, we have a reference group that includes Indigenous members. We have the Tweed Shire Youth Network oversight, which includes Indigenous groups. And we also have, to help me with difficult ethics questions. One of the problems is, in this situation, if a young person discloses something to me as a result of this interview, is that a cultural practice, or is it something that I need to inform authorities about because I have a duty of care to the young people? And one of the ethical solutions to that problem was Indigenous guidance. So I am at this moment in time taking on a local elder, a local in the Bundjalung area, to help me with that aspect of my research.
Okay, thanks, Dad. Well, look, that was a really great presentation. So